Chapter 10 of The Ball and the Cross. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 10. The Swords Rejoined. As they came over the hill and down on the other side of it, it is not too much to say that the whole universe of God opened over them and under them, like a thing unfolding to 5 times its size. Almost under their feet opened the enormous sea, at the bottom of a steep valley which fell down into a bay, and the sea under their feet blazed at them almost as lustrous and almost as empty as the sky. The sunrise opened above them like some cosmic explosion, shining and shattering and yet silent, as if the world were blown to pieces without a sound. Round the rays of the victorious sun swept a sort of rainbow of confused and conquered colors, brown and blue and green and flaming rose color, as though gold were driving before it all the colors of the world. The lines of the landscape down which they sped were the simple, strict, yet swerving, lines of a rushing river, so that it was almost as if they were being sucked down in a huge still whirlpool. Turnbull had some such feeling, for he spoke for the first time for many hours. "If we go down at this rate we shall be over the sea cliff," he said. "How glorious!" said MacIan. When, however, they had come into the wide hollow at the bottom of that landslide, the car took a calm and graceful curve along the side of the sea, melted into the fringe of a few trees, and quietly, yet astonishingly, stopped. A belated light was burning in the broad morning in the window of a sort of lodge, or gatekeeper's cottage, and the girl stood up in the car and turned her splendid face to the sun. Evan seemed startled by the stillness, like one who had been born amid sound and speed. He wavered on his long legs as he stood up, he pulled himself together, and the only consequence was that he trembled from head to foot. Turnbull had already opened the door on his side and jumped out. The moment he had done so, the strange young woman had one more mad movement, and deliberately drove the car a few yards farther. Then she got out with an almost cruel coolness and began pulling off her long gloves and almost whistling. "You can leave me here," she said quite casually, as if they had met 5 minutes before. "That is the lodge of my father's place. Please come in if you like, but I understand that you had some business." Evan looked at that lifted face and found it merely lovely. He was far too much of a fool to see that it was working with a final fatigue, and that its austerity was agony. He was even fool enough to ask it a question. "Why did you save us?" he said quite humbly. The girl tore off one of her gloves as if she were tearing off her hand. "Oh, I don't know," she said bitterly. "Now I come to think of it, I can't imagine." Evan's thoughts, that had been piled up to the morning star, abruptly let him down with a crash into the very cellars of the emotional universe. He remained in a stunned silence for a long time, and that, if he had only known, was the wisest thing that he could possibly do at the moment. Indeed, the silence and the sunrise had their healing effect, for when the extraordinary lady spoke again, her tone was more friendly and apologetic. "I'm not really ungrateful," she said. "It was very good of you to save me from those men." "But why?" repeated the obstinate and dazed MacIan. "Why did you save us from the other men, I mean the policemen?" The girl's great brown eyes were lit up with a flash that was at once final desperation and the loosening of some private and passionate reserve. "Oh, God knows!" she cried. "God knows that if there is a God he had turned his big back on everything. God knows I have had no pleasure in my life, though I am pretty and young and father has plenty of money. And then people come and tell me that I ought to do things, and I do them, and it's all drivel. They want you to do work among the poor, which means reading Ruskin and feeling self-righteous in the best room in a poor tenement; or to help some cause or other, which always means bundling people out of crooked houses in which they've always lived into straight houses in which they often die. And all the time you have inside only the horrid irony of your own empty head and empty heart. I am to give to the unfortunate when my whole misfortune is that I have nothing to give? I am to teach, when I believe nothing at all that I was taught. I am to save the children from death, and I am not even certain that I should not be better dead. I suppose if I actually saw a child drowning I should save it. But that would be from the same motive from which I have saved you or destroyed you, whichever it is that I have done." "What was the motive?" asked Evan in a low voice. "My motive is too big for my mind," answered the girl. Then after a pause, as she stared with a rising color at the glittering sea, she said, "It can't be described, and yet I am trying to describe it. It seems to me not only that I am unhappy, but that there is no way of being happy. Father is not happy, though he is a member of Parliament." She paused a moment, and added with a ghost of a smile, "Nor Aunt Mabel, though a man from India has told her the secret of all creeds. But I may be wrong, there may be a way out, and for one stark insane second I felt that, after all, you had got the way out and that was why the world hated you. You see, if there were a way out, it would be sure to be something that looked very queer." Evan put his hand to his forehead and began stumblingly, "Yes, I suppose we do seem—" "Oh, yes, you look queer enough," she said with ringing sincerity. "You'll be all the better for a wash and brush up." "You forget our business, madame," said Evan in a shaking voice. "We have no concern but to kill each other." "Well, I shouldn't be killed looking like that if I were you," she replied with inhuman honesty. Evan stood and rolled his eyes in masculine bewilderment. Then came the final change in this Proteus, and she put out both her hands for an instant and said in a low tone on which he lived for days and nights, "Don't you understand that I did not dare to stop you? What you are doing is so mad that it may be quite true. Somehow one can never really manage to be an atheist." Turnbull stood staring at the sea, but his shoulders showed that he heard, and after 1 minute he turned his head. But the girl had only brushed Evan's hand with hers and had fled up the dark alley by the lodge gate. Evan stood rooted upon the road, literally like some heavy statue hewn there in the age of the Druids. It seemed impossible that he should ever move. Turnbull grew restless with this rigidity, and at last, after calling his companion twice or thrice, went up and clapped him impatiently on one of his big shoulders. Evan winced and leapt away from him with a repulsion which was not the hate of an unclean thing nor the dread of a dangerous one, but was a spasm of awe and separation from something from which he was now sundered as by the sword of God. He did not hate the atheist. It is possible that he loved him. But Turnbull was now something more dreadful than an enemy. He was a thing sealed and devoted, a thing now hopelessly doomed to be either a corpse or an executioner. "What is the matter with you?" asked Turnbull, with his hearty hand still in the air, and yet he knew more about it than his innocent action would allow. "James," said Evan, speaking like one under strong bodily pain, "I asked for God's answer, and I have got it in my vitals. He knows how weak I am, and that I might forget the peril of the faith, forget the face of Our Lady. Yes, even with your blow upon her cheek. But the honor of this earth has just this about it, that it can make a man's heart like iron. I am from the Lords of the Isles, and I dare not be a mere deserter. Therefore God has tied me by the chain of my worldly place and word, and there is nothing but fighting now." "I think I understand you," said Turnbull, "but you say everything tail foremost." "She wants us to do it," said Evan, in a voice crushed with passion. "She has hurt herself so that we might do it. She has left her good name and her good sleep and all her habits and dignity flung away on the other side of England, in the hope that she may hear of us and that we have broken some hole into heaven." "I thought I knew what you mean," said Turnbull, biting his beard. "It does seem as if we ought to do something after all she has done this night." "I never liked you so much before," said MacIan in bitter sorrow. As he spoke, 3 solemn footmen came out of the lodge gate and assembled to assist the chauffeur to his room. The mere sight of them made the two wanderers flee as from a too frightful incongruity, and before they knew where they were well upon the grassy ledge of England that overlooks the Channel. Evan said suddenly, "Will they let me see her in heaven once in 1,000 ages?" and addressed the remark to the editor of the Atheist, as on which he would be likely or qualified to answer. But no answer came, a silence sank between the two. Turnbull strode sturdily to the edge of the cliff and looked out, his companion following, somewhat more shaken by his recent agitation. "If that's the view you take," said Turnbull, "and I don't say you are wrong, I think I know where we shall be best off for the business. As it happens, I know this part of the south coast pretty well, and unless I am mistaken, there's a way down the cliff just here which will land us on a stretch of firm sand where no one is likely to follow us." The Highlander made a gesture of assent and came also almost to the edge of the precipice. The sunrise, which was broadening over sea and shore, was one of those rare and splendid ones in which there seems to be no mist or doubt, and nothing but a universal clarification more and more complete. All the colors were transparent. It seemed like a triumphant prophecy of some perfect world where everything being innocent will be intelligible, a world where even our bodies, so to speak, may be as of burning glass. Such a world is faintly though fiercely figured in the colored windows of Christian architecture. The sea that lay before them was like a pavement of emerald, bright and almost brittle. The sky against which its strict horizon hung was almost absolutely white, except that close to the skyline, like scarlet braids on the hem of a garment, lay strings of flaky cloud of so gleaming and gorgeous a red that they seemed cut out of some strange blood-red celestial metal, of which the mere gold of this earth is but a drab yellow imitation. "The hand of heaven is still pointing," muttered the man of superstition to himself, "and now it is a blood-red hand." The cool voice of his companion cut in upon his monologue, calling to him from a little farther along the cliff to tell him that he had found the ladder of descent. It began as a steep and somewhat greasy path, which then tumbled down 20 or 30 feet in the form of a fall of rough stone steps. After that there was a rather awkward drop onto a ledge of stone, and then the journey was undertaken easily and even elegantly by the remains of an ornamental staircase, such as might have belonged to some long disused watering place. All the time that the two travelers sank from stage to stage of this downward journey there closed over their heads living bridges and caverns of the most varied foliage, all of which grew greener, redder, or more golden in the growing sunlight of the morning. Life, too, of the more moving sort rose at the sun on every side of them. Birds whirred and fluttered in the undergrowth as if imprisoned in green cages. Other birds were shaken up in great clouds from the tree-tops, as if they were blossoms detached and scattered up to heaven. Animals which Turnbull was too much of a Londoner and MacIan too much of a Northerner to know slipped by among the tangle or ran pattering up the tree-trunks. Both the men, according to their several creeds, felt the full thunder of the psalm of life as they had never heard it before. MacIan felt God the Father benignant in all his energies, and Turnbull that ultimate anonymous energy, that natura naturans, which is the whole theme of Lucretius. It was down this clamorous ladder of life that they went down to die. They broke out upon a brown semicircle of sand, so free from human imprint as to justify Turnbull's profession. They strode out upon it, stuck their swords in the sand, and had a pause too important for speech. Turnbull eyed the coast curiously for a moment, like one awakening memories of childhood. Then he said abruptly, like a man remembering somebody's name, "But, of course, we shall be better off still round the corner of Cragness Point. Nobody ever comes there at all." And picking up his sword again, he began striding towards a big bluff of the rocks which stood out upon their left. MacIan followed him round the corner and found himself in what was certainly an even finer fencing court, of flat, firm sand, enclosed on 3 sides by white walls of rock, and on the fourth by the green wall of the advancing sea. "We are quite safe here," said Turnbull, and, to the other's surprise, flung himself down, sitting on the brown beach. "You see, I was brought up near here," he explained. "I was sent from Scotland to stop with my aunt. It is highly probable that I may die here. Do you mind if I light a pipe?" "Of course, do whatever you like," said MacIan, with a choking voice, and he went and walked alone by himself along the wet, glistening sands. 10 minutes afterwards he came back again, white with his own whirlwind of emotions. Turnbull was quite cheerful, and was knocking out the end of his pipe. "You see, we have to do it," said MacIan. "She tied us to it." "Of course, my dear fellow," said the other, and leapt up as lightly as a monkey. They took their places gravely in the very center of the great square of sand, as if they had thousands of spectators. Before saluting, MacIan, who, being a mystic, was 1 inch nearer to nature, cast his eye round the huge framework of their heroic folly. The 3 walls of rock all leant a little outward, though at various angles; but this impression was exaggerated in the direction of the incredible by the heavy load of living trees and thickets which each wall wore on its top like a huge shock of hair. On all that luxurious crest of life the risen and victorious sun was beating, burnishing it all like gold, and every bird that rose with that sunrise caught a light like a star upon it, like the dove of the Holy Spirit. Imaginative life had never so much crowded upon MacIan. He felt that he could write whole books about the feelings of a single bird. He felt that for 2 centuries he would not tire of being a rabbit. He was in the palace of life, of which the very tapestries and curtains were alive. Then he recovered himself and remembered his affairs. Both men saluted, and iron rang upon iron. It was exactly at the same moment that he realized that his enemy's left ankle was encircled with a ring of salt water that had crept up to his feet. "What is the matter?" said Turnbull, stopping an instant, for he had grown used to every movement of his extraordinary fellow-traveller's face. MacIan glanced again at that silver anklet of sea-water, and then looked beyond at the next promontory round which a deep sea was boiling and leaping. Then he turned and looked back, and saw heavy foam being shaken up to heaven about the base of Cragness Point. "The sea has cut us off," he said curtly. "I have noticed it," said Turnbull with equal sobriety. "What view do you take of the development?" Evan threw away his weapon, and, as his custom was, imprisoned his big head in his hands. Then he let them fall and said, "Yes, I know what it means, and I think it is the fairest thing. It is the finger of God, red as blood, still pointing. But now it points to 2 graves." There was a space filled with the sound of the sea, and then MacIan spoke again in a voice pathetically reasonable. "You see, we both saved her, and she told us both to fight, and it would not be just that either should fail and fall alone, while the other—" "You mean," said Turnbull in a voice surprisingly soft and gentle, "that there is something fine about fighting in a place where even the conqueror must die?" "Oh, you have got it right, you have got it right!" cried out Evan, in an extraordinary childish ecstasy. "Oh, I'm sure that you really believe in God." Turnbull answered not a word, but only took up his fallen sword. For the 3rd time Evan MacIan looked at those 3 sides of English cliff hung with their noisy load of life. He had been at a loss to understand the almost ironical magnificence of all those teeming creatures and tropical colors and smells that smoked happily to heaven, but now he knew that he was in the closed court of death, and that all the gates were sealed. He drank in the last green and the last red and the last gold, those unique and indescribable things of God, as a man drains good wine at the bottom of his glass. Then he turned and saluted his enemy once more, and the 2 stood up and fought till the foam flowed over their knees. Then MacIan stepped backward suddenly with a splash and held up his hand. "Turnbull," he cried, "I can't help it. Fair fighting is more even than promises, and this is not fair fighting." "What the deuce do you mean?" cried the other, staring. "I've only just thought of it," cried Evan brokenly. "We're very well matched. It may go on a good time. The tide is coming up fast, and I'm a foot and a half taller. You'll be washed away like seaweed before it's above my breeches. I'll not fight foul for all the girls and angels in the universe." "Will you oblige me," said Turnbull, with staring grey eyes and a voice of distinct and violent politeness, "will you oblige me by jolly well minding your own business? Just you stand up and fight, and we'll see who will be washed away like seaweed. You wanted to finish this fight, and you shall finish it, or I'll denounce you as a coward to the whole of that assembled company." Evan looked very doubtful and offered a somewhat wavering weapon, but he was quickly brought back to his senses by his opponent's sword point, which shot past him, shaving his shoulder by a hair. By this time the waves were well up Turnbull's thigh, and what was worse, they were beginning to roll and break heavily around them. MacIan parried this first lunge perfectly, the next less perfectly, the third in all human probability he would not have parried at all, the Christian champion would have been pinned like a butterfly, and the atheistic champion left to drown like a rat, with such consolation as his view of the cosmos afforded him. But just as Turnbull launched his heaviest stroke, the sea, in which he stood up to his hips, launched a yet heavier one. A wave breaking beyond the others smote him heavily like a hammer of water. One leg gave way, he was swung round and sucked into the retreating sea, still gripping his sword. MacIan put his sword between his teeth and plunged after his disappearing enemy. He had the sense of having the whole universe on top of him as crest after crest struck him down. It seemed to him quite a cosmic collapse, as if all the seven heavens were falling on him one after the other. But he got hold of the atheist's left leg, and he did not let go. After some 10 minutes of foam and frenzy, in which all the senses at once seemed blasted by the sea, Evan found himself laboriously swimming on a low green swell, with the sword still in his teeth, and the editor of the Atheist still under his arm. What he was going to do he had not even the most glimmering idea, so he merely kept his grip and swam somehow with one hand. He ducked instinctively as there bulked above him a big black wave, much higher than any that he had seen. Then he saw that it was hardly the shape of any possible wave. Then he saw that it was a fisherman's boat, and, leaping upward, caught hold of the bow. The boat pitched forward with its stern in the air for just as much time as was needed to see that there was nobody in it. After a moment or two of desperate clambering, however, there were 2 people in it, Mr. Evan MacIan, panting and sweating, and Mr. James Turnbull, uncommonly close to being drowned. After 10 minutes' aimless tossing in the empty fishing boat, he recovered, however, stirred, stretched himself, and looked round on the rolling waters. Then, while taking no notice of the streams of salt water that were pouring from his hair, beard, coat, boots, and trousers, he carefully wiped the wet off his sword blade to preserve it from the possibilities of rust. MacIan found 2 oars in the bottom of the deserted boat and began somewhat drearily to row. A rainy twilight was clearing to cold silver over the moaning sea, when the battered boat that had rolled and drifted almost aimlessly all night came within sight of land, though of land which looked almost as lost and savage as the waves. All night there had been but little lifting in the leaden sea, only now and then the boat had been heaved up, as on a huge shoulder which slipped from under it. Such occasional sea quakes came probably from the swell of some steamer that had passed it in the dark. Otherwise the waves were harmless though restless. But it was piercingly cold, and there was, from time to time, a splutter of rain like the splutter of the spray, which seemed almost to freeze as it fell. MacIan, more at home than his companion in this quite barbarous and elemental sort of adventure, had rowed toilsomely with the heavy oars whenever he saw anything that looked like land, but for the most part had trusted with grim transcendentalism to wind and tide. Among the implements of their first outfit the brandy alone had remained to him, and he gave it to his freezing companion in quantities which greatly alarmed that temperate Londoner. But MacIan came from the cold seas and mists, where a man can drink a tumbler of raw whiskey in a boat without it making him wink. When the Highlander began to pull really hard upon the oars, Turnbull craned his dripping red head out of the boat to see the goal of his exertions. It was a sufficiently uninviting one, nothing so far as could be seen but a steep and shelving bank of shingle, made of loose little pebbles such as children like, but slanting up higher than a house. On the top of the mound, against the skyline, stood up the brown skeleton of some broken fence or breakwater. With the grey and watery dawn crawling up behind it, the fence really seemed to say to our philosophic adventurers that they had come at last to the other end of nowhere. Bent by necessity to his labour, MacIan managed the heavy boat with real power and skill, and when at length he ran it up on a smoother part of the slope, it caught and held so that they could clamber out, not sinking farther than their knees into the water and the shingle. A foot or two farther up their feet found the beach firmer, and a few moments afterwards they were leaning on the ragged breakwater and looking back at the sea they had escaped. They had a dreary walk across wastes of grey shingle in the grey dawn before they began to come within hail of human fields or roads. Nor had they any notion of what fields or roads they would be. Their boots were beginning to break up and the confusion of stones tried them severely, so that they were glad to lean on their swords as if they were the staves of pilgrims. MacIan thought vaguely of a weird ballad of his own country which describes the soul in purgatory as walking on a plain full of sharp stones, and only saved by its own charities upon earth. If thou gavest hosen and shoon every night and all, sit thee down and put them on, and Christ receive thy soul. Turnbull had no such lyrical meditations, but he was in an even worse temper. At length they came to a pale ribbon of road, edged by a shelf of rough and almost colourless turf, and a few feet up the slope there stood grey and weather-stained one of those big wayside crucifixes which are seldom seen except in Catholic countries. MacIan put his hand to his head and found that his bonnet was not there. Turnbull gave one glance at the crucifix, a glance at once sympathetic and bitter, in which was concentrated the whole of Swinburne's poem on the same occasion. O hidden face of man, whereover the years have woven a viewless veil, if thou wert verily man's lover, what did thy love or blood avail? Thy blood the priests mix poison of, and in gold shekels coin they love. Then, leaving MacIan in his attitude of prayer, Turnbull began to look right and left very sharply, like one looking for something. Suddenly, with a little cry, he saw it and ran forward. A few yards from them, along the road, a lean and starved sort of hedge came pitifully to an end. Caught upon its prickly angle, however, there was a very small and very dirty scrap of paper that might have hung there for months, since it escaped from someone tearing up a letter or making a spill out of a newspaper. Turnbull snatched at it and found that it was the corner of a printed page, very coarsely printed, like a cheap novelette, and just large enough to contain the words, Et c'est elle qui. "Hurrah!" cried Turnbull, waving his fragment. "We are safe at last! We are free at last! We are somewhere better than England or Eden or Paradise! MacIan, we are in the land of the duel!" "Where do you say?" said the other, looking at him heavily and with knitted brows, like one almost dazed with the grey doubts of desolate twilight and drifting sea. "We are in France!" cried Turnbull, with a voice like a trumpet. "In the land where things really happen. Tout arrive en France. We arrive in France. Look at this little message," and he held out the scrap of paper. "There's an omen for you superstitious hill folk. C'est elle qui, my oui, c'est elle qui sauvera encore le monde." "France!" repeated MacIan, and his eyes awoke again in his head like large lamps lighted. "Yes, France!" said Turnbull, and all the rhetorical part of him came to the top, his face growing as red as his hair. "France, that has always been in rebellion for liberty and reason. France, that has always assailed superstition with the club of Rabelais or the rapier of Voltaire. France, at whose first council table sits the sublime figure of Julian the Apostate. France, where a man said only the other day those splendid unanswerable words," with a superb gesture, "we have extinguished in heaven those lights that men shall never light again." "No," said MacIan, with a voice that shook with controlled passion, "but France, which was taught by St. Bernard and led to war by Joan of Arc, France that made the Crusades, France that saved the Church and scattered the heresies by the mouths of Bossuet and Massillon, France which shows today the conquering march of Catholicism as brain after brain surrenders to it, Brunetière, Coppée, Hauptmann, Barré, Bourget, Lemaitre." "France," asserted Turnbull with a sort of rollicking self-exaggeration very unusual with him, "France, which is one torrent of splendid scepticism from Abelard to Anatole, France." "France," said MacIan, "which is one cataract of clear faith from St. Louis to Our Lady of Lourdes." "France, at least," cried Turnbull, throwing up his sword in schoolboy triumph, "in which these things are thought about and fought about. France, where reason and religion clash in one continual tournament. France, above all, where men understand the pride and passion which have plucked our blades from their scabbards. Here, at least, we shall not be chased and spied on by sickly parsons and greasy policemen, because we wish to put our lives on the game. Courage, my friend, we have come to the country of honor." MacIan did not even notice the incongruous phrase, "my friend," but nodding again and again, drew his sword and flung the scabbard far behind him in the road. "Yes," he cried in a voice of thunder, "we shall fight here, and he shall look on at it." Turnbull glanced at the crucifix with a sort of scowling good humour, and then said, "He may look and see his cross defeated." "The cross cannot be defeated," said MacIan, "for it is defeat." A second afterwards the two bright, bloodthirsty weapons made the sign of the cross in horrible parody upon each other. They had not touched each other twice, however, when upon the hill, above the crucifix, there appeared another horrible parody of its shape, the figure of a man who appeared for an instant waving his outspread arms. He had vanished in an instant, but MacIan, whose fighting face was set that way, had seen the shape momentarily, but quite photographically. And while it was like a comic repetition of the cross, it was also, in that place and hour, something more incredible. It had been only instantaneously on the retina of his eye, but unless his eye and mind were going mad together, the figure was that of an ordinary London policeman. He tried to concentrate his senses on the sword play, but one half of his brain was wrestling with the puzzle. The apocalyptic and almost seraphic apparition of a stout constable out of Clapham on top of a dreary and deserted hill in France. He did not, however, have to puzzle long. Before the duelists had exchanged half a dozen passes, the big blue policeman appeared once more on the top of the hill, a palpable monstrosity in the eye of heaven. He was waving only one arm now, and seemed to be shouting directions. At the same moment a mass of blue blocked the corner of the road behind the small, smart figure of Turnbull, and a small company of policemen in the English uniform came up at a kind of half-military double. Turnbull saw the stare of consternation in his enemy's face and swung round to share its cause. When he saw it, cool as he was, he staggered back. "What the devil are you doing here?" he cried out in a high, shrill voice of authority, like one who finds a tramp in his own larder. "Well, sir," said the sergeant in command, with that sort of heavy civility shown only to the evidently guilty, "seems to me we might ask what you are doing here." "We are having an affair of honour," said Turnbull, as if it were the most rational thing in the world. "If the French police like to interfere, let them interfere. But why the blue blazes should you interfere, you great blue blundering sausages?" "I'm afraid, sir," said the sergeant with restraint, "I'm afraid I don't quite follow you." "I mean, why don't the French police take this up if it's got to be taken up? I always heard that they were spry enough in their own way." "Well, sir," said the sergeant reflectively, You see, sir, the French police don't take this up, well, because you see, sir, this ain't France. This is His Majesty's dominions, same as Amsterdam." "Not France?" repeated Turnbull, with a sort of dull incredulity. "No, sir," said the sergeant, "though most of the people talk French. This is the island called St. Loup, sir, an island in the Channel. We've been sent down specially from London, as you are such specially distinguished criminals, if you'll allow me to say so. Which reminds me to warn you that anything you say may be used against you at your trial." "Quite so," said Turnbull, and lurched suddenly against the sergeant, so as to tip him over the edge of the road with a crash into the shingle below. Then leaving MacIan and the policemen equally and instantaneously nailed to the road, he ran a little way along it, leapt off onto a part of the beach, which he had found in his journey to be firmer, and went across it with a clatter of pebbles. His sudden calculation was successful. The police, unacquainted with the various levels of the loose beach, tried to overtake him by the shorter cut, and found themselves, being heavy men, almost up to their knees in shoals of slippery shingle. Two who had been slower with their bodies were quicker with their minds, and seeing Turnbull's trick, ran along the edge of the road after him. Then MacIan finally awoke, and leaving half his sleeve in the grip of the only man who tried to hold him, took the two policemen in the small of their backs with the impetus of a cannon ball, and, sending them also flat among the stones, went tearing after his twin defier of the law. As they were both good runners, the start they had gained was decisive. They dropped over a high breakwater farther on upon the beach, turned sharply, and scrambled up a line of ribbed rocks crowned with a thicket, crawled through it, scratching their hands and faces, and dropped into another road, and there found that they could slacken their speed into a steady trot. In all this desperate dart and scramble they still kept hold of their drawn swords, which now, indeed, in the vigorous phrase of Bunyan, seemed almost to grow out of their hands. They had run another half-mile or so when it became apparent that they were entering a sort of scattered village. One or two whitewashed cottages and even a shop had appeared along the side of the road. Then, for the first time, Turnbull twisted round his red head to get a glimpse of his companion, who was a foot or two behind, and remarked abruptly, "Mr. MacIan, we've been going the wrong way to work all along. We're traced everywhere, because everybody knows about us. It's as if one went about with Kruger's beard on Mafeking night." "What do you mean?" said MacIan innocently. "I mean," said Turnbull, with steady conviction, "that what we want is a little diplomacy, and I'm going to buy some in a shop." Chapter 11.